The time has come for my people to go.
I'm not a queen, I'm a servant of the people. I'm not a king, I'm a servant of the people. It's what the people demand, and we gonna keep fighting till we get that land. I'm not a queen, I'm a servant of the people. I'm not a king, I'm a servant of the people. It's time to rise, to get what we want, we got to organize.
Greetings, everybody. We hope that you are well and that you are in your highest state of mental, physical, and spiritual health whenever and wherever you are listening. My name is Jesse, and I am here with Comrade Winfred to welcome you to another episode of the Pantsula Podcast, brought to you by the All African People's Revolutionary Party. The A-APRP was founded by Kwame in 1968 and is based in Africa. We are a mass Pan-African organization, and our objective is the total liberation and unification of Africa under scientific socialism. If you have any questions about what this means, you can head over to our website at aaprp-intl.org. You can also leave a comment on this video with any questions, concerns, or criticisms you may have, and we will get back to you. We want to thank you for taking the time to listen. And as with every episode, we take the time to acknowledge our ancestors because we understand that without them, there would be no us. So, Comrade Winfred, who are the ancestors we are honoring today?
Hi, everyone. So we'll be honoring two ancestors. The first is Bobby Hutton, born April 21 in 1950 in Jefferson County, Texas. He and his family moved to Oakland, California when he was 3 years old in order to escape night riders who terrorized Black people in the area. At age 16, he was the first recruit and first treasurer of the Black Panther Party after meeting Huey Newton and Bobby Seale at the North Oakland Neighborhood Anti-Poverty Center. And unfortunately, on April 6, 1968, 2 weeks before his 18th birthday, he was gunned down by the police in a raid. And after his passing, his name was attached to the Infirmary Park in West Oakland, California. And there has been an annual Little Bobby Hutton Day in his honor since 1998. Our second ancestor is Teytu Butul, born in 1851. She was Queen and Empress of Ethiopia. She convinced the Ethiopian government to fight against Italian attempts at colonialism, and also personally fought in the war against Italy, personally commanding fleets in the historic Battle of Adwa, in which Ethiopia defeated Italian troops. She passed in 1918 and was buried in Addis Ababa, the city she and her husband Menelik II founded in 1886.
Yes. Thank you, Comrade. Ashe, we thank and honor every day the work that has been done by our ancestors because, as mentioned, we would not be here unless someone else committed to the struggle for our forward progress. And today we are going to be talking about why African history is not taught in U.S. schools. In light of the recent news with 30 states choosing not to teach quote unquote Black history, but we understand it to be African history in public schools. I just want to start off with asking you, Winfred, how should we respond to this recent decision and if our history has ever been taught properly to begin with?
So I would say that really a large part of what we're taught in education depends on the goals of the people teaching us. So this isn't necessarily individual teachers, but on top of that, larger structures that decide what curriculum will be, and the different parties that may influence that, whether it be lobbyists, whether it be politicians trying to win another election, whether it be parents concerned about what topics children are being taught. Overall, I think African history has been very limited in schools and oftentimes very biased against African attempts at independence. and self-sufficiency. And so in this act of people saying that African history should not be taught further, it seems to be another historical backlash against Black people having rights and Black people having knowledge, Black people and Africans having knowledge of self within America and throughout the world as well.
Right. Yeah. I mean, to your point, I think when it comes to revolution, which is what all African and colonized folks should really look forward to, that's not necessarily being taught. I know when I was in high school, the most they taught us about was the Underground Railroad. You heard some briefings about Harriet Tubman and some things, but we don't really hear our history taught. And I don't think that should surprise any of us when we understand that we are living in a capitalist world, where in which the knowledge that is given to students mainly is just to work, and there's never really a full picture being told, and that's the normative. So I think with this new Stop Woke Act that Ron DeSantis signed over, it's like there's never really been an honest attempt at showing and teaching our history correctly. So I get that there's frustration because notable authors have been banned, from Bell Hooks and a lot of other predominant Black authors discussing race and gender. But when we really think of our history and when we really study our history, we understand that that history has never really been expressed because, again, it's revolutionary, and the job of capitalism and imperialism is to diminish and basically disqualify any leaning towards revolution, because we are at war. That must be constantly reminded to folks. We're living in a state of war. There's violence, and this violence is going to continue because of the nature of the system. I mean, capitalism is violent. And so when it comes to reforming our consciousness and all of the propaganda that's out there to keep us blind to who we really are, this decision should not really surprise us. And I don't think folks should really expect the state. We hear a lot of quotes like, "Oh, the system is broken." The system is actually working as it was intended. And so with this decision and with many other decisions that are going to be passed, more than likely, we have to just remember and also go back to political education and educate our own communities so that we are not misled by the new transitions of what the system offers us.
Exactly. And I think there is one other motivation for having acts that don't teach African history in America, African history in general, but in this context, African history in America specifically. I think if you look at the really throughout all of American history in which Europeans have interacted with Africans in this country of the U.S., there has been abuse, there has been theft, there has been murder, there have been crimes committed endlessly against Africans in America. And really from indentured servitude to slavery to Jim Crow, really up to today, there's still large amounts of theft and murder and crimes done against Africans that haven't been accounted for. And so I think in this case, particularly with the Stop Woke Act, having no African history taught in schools about African America could lead to a lack of knowledge about things like Jim Crow and times in which land from Africans living in America have been stolen, in which resources, in which lives have been lost. And just from a basic financial perspective, for people who would benefit from the Stop Woke Act, if there is no knowledge of like which lands have been stolen, if there is no knowledge of like what things have been taken away from Black people and from Africans, there would be no way to have any legal accountability. So, for example, I think a couple of years ago, there was this beach in California in which it was found that the government had stolen the land from a family of Africans who had lived there in the past. And so recently, pretty recently, the government had given the land back to that family because it was rightfully there, well, relative to uh, American law. But that means that if we were to know that, hey, like, there's a lot of land has been stolen from people according to the law. Let's file lawsuits. Let's go through the legal course of action that in the society we're quote unquote supposed to. It would mean that a lot of land would be taken back. A lot of land would be given back to people for whom it was stolen from. And this is not even like 100 years ago. It's like 50, 40, maybe even like 30, 20 years ago. And so if we just had no history of what happened, or at least just said the past is the past and let's start from now in a clean slate, all of the resources, all of the land that has been taken would just be forgotten. And so there's a very big financial incentive for people to say, hey, we shouldn't discuss the past.
And I mean, and this goes to the point of being educated, right? Because we should understand that this land, all of the Western Hemisphere, belongs to the native indigenous folks. So,
Exactly.
Of course, talking about land and resources and raw materials is not on their agenda. You know, a lot of folks are just trained to believe through the propaganda system that all of this land is ours and that, you know, even Africans that have worked on this land, that they belong or that they have some right to this land. But we understand, and I'm understanding more and more the more I do this work, the importance of land back and why it's important for folks to have their own land, just like Africa has been stolen by all of these corporations and our resources are being used to fuel the world. Having that knowledge is paramount and essential. And, you know, this also goes back to the fact that capitalism is an ideological war. It's not just about the stealing of resources and violence. It's also about shaping our minds and basically numbing us to the idea that we can just be individuals and we can have our own success without thinking about the collective effort that's needed to overthrow the system. And America being a capitalist nation, and not just America, of course, because this is not just particularly happening here in the Snakes. We know that in Europe and anywhere, even in Africa, obviously, where there is education being taught, and I say education with quotes because it's not truly education, but they're giving us information that is aligned with their interests. It's not aligned to any socialist or revolutionary mindset. And so folks are reading about who America and the colonizers deem as heroes. Like we hear a lot of talk about these presidents and these businessmen and all these folks that have actually stolen and plunder that is done through violence. All of these things are done, and yet we're getting such a washed up version of what it really is. And back to political education, we have to know our history. We have to know why these things are done. It's not just done to keep the peace. As you said, there's obviously financial incentives, and in an age where we have social media and general access to the internet, it's amazing how many folks are not really taking advantage. I mean, it's just so much propaganda out there. And if you're not involved in an organization, and if you're not really reading from primary sources, of course, you're going to be quickly ensnared in all of it and really parroting the same talking points that are seemingly revolutionary, but they're not. They're in line with the state. And we really got to do all that's necessary to fight that, because it's happening in a time where folks can watch a video on TikTok or watch a short little video on YouTube, and they're not doing their primary sources. They're not reading that. And so they're easily confused. And this is intentional, and I think if anything, currently we're in the month of February, which is also known as Black History Month. But as I said, there's no, obviously we're Black, but I like to say, and we always identify as African because there's no Black continent, right? Like, we come from Africa. And if we understand all of what Africa is providing to the world, the more we study our history, we will be proud of our history and would want to fight for Mother Africa because it's under attack. We are under attack being in this country. And wherever colonized folks are, we have to connect the dots. And one of the reasons I think this conversation is important is because when folks, especially right now, when they think of their history as it's being taught, we hear about these individuals, like Madam C.J. Walker, folks that have invented things. And it's like, and then often a lot of our history is also just brought up with slavery. I'm glad that you mentioned the ancestors today, Bobby Hutton and Teytu, Butul, because they, you're not going to hear about them in history books, right? You're not going to hear a lot about revolutionaries and folks that have fought against the system. We always hear, even when Martin Luther King Jr. is mentioned, it's often just that he wanted to unite white folks and Black folks. No one is talking about his anti-war speech in Vietnam or anything like that. Right. Those things are never talked about. And it's to basically give us a version that is like, hey, you can be like this individual, instead of connecting with the organized masses. And, so it's really a call to our history and our herstory, our their history, just to look beyond what the state has given us. And a lot of the outrage that comes from folks when this bill was signed, and as I said, there are going to be other bills like this signed because this is an ideological war. They want to take our minds away from the true enemy, which is themselves. Folks are talking about capitalism, but they're not connecting capitalism to global imperialism. And these are intentional things that are being done. And, this whole Individual Freedom Act, which was signed, is just another version of keeping the masses away from our true story so that we know what's really going on. So one question I also want to ask is, how do we learn from what's happened in the past? And how does the past affect our current present, since we know all of it is connected?
Yeah, I'd say since we do know all of it is connected, at this point, I guess the first thing we can do is try to have an understanding of where we are now. Just try to understand our current economics, and then from that, current economics, current political state, current social state, and then start asking a lot of why questions. So, just basic investigating stuff. So let's ask, like, why are there poor people? What does it mean to be poor? Why do people not have the ability to have a say in their government? And then from asking all of those why questions, you can start to find like what people, what individuals, what institutions played a part in how things are today. And then do research, do reading to have a deeper and wider understanding of how things came up today. And so in your search for how and why things are in the present, you'll end up uncovering and discovering how things were in the past. I think very fortunately, there are people who were alive during the past, because as of right now, we're speaking in the past. since this is a recording of the past, technically. Um, so you can look at interviews, look at documents, at least for the US, look at census records of like what state were people in at that point in time. And then read, listen to interviews of those people, read books. Um, so, for example, as for American history, there's a historian. His name is Gerald Horne. You can look to him for different resources as to like what happened really from the revolutionary period onwards. Ask yourself if you have figure out any questions you have about why things are going the way they are, and then do the research. Try to figure out people who might have information. But an important thing to uh, recognize when you are asking these questions and looking for answers uh, is understanding that there's almost always a material reason as to why something is happening. So, in the words of a famous speaker, cui bono, which is Italian for who benefits. So, even in this iteration of the Stop Woke Act, you can see, if you ask yourself, oh, why is this happening? You can see like clear, like financial, material, like reasoning for why like a group of people would say, hey, forget about the past. Because for them, if you're working on stolen land, whether it's like 50 or 60 years ago with Jim Crow laws, or several hundred years ago with stealing the land from the people who are indigenous to the Americas, it will be there. Like there's a clear understanding that if you just forget about the history, then nobody will really question why they have the land now, and there won't be legal cases against them. So if you there's almost so usually there's a material reason why people are doing things. So when you look for the whys, make sure that you connect it with like tangible reasons.
Right. I mean, I'm glad you mentioned that. That's one of the reasons we understand the importance of dialectical materialism, because we understand that there's a relationship between all of the changes in history, and that everything has positives and negatives. Nothing is wholly good or wholly bad. And just breaking away from the idealist mindset, because a lot of idealism is taught to us in history from academia and obviously movies and any form of media. And folks just go to the idea without connecting the material reality. And we have to be dialectical in that aspect, because the changes that have happened and that will happen are relational. They relate to other things that have happened. It's not just falling out of thin air. There's a reason why folks are poor. There's a reason why the rich are getting richer. There's a reason why needs are not being met. And it's going back to that ideological framework. And so when we understand that, when we also read the resources that are available to us from the state, I mean, you can actually go to CIA.gov and read some of the unclassified documents to see what America's intention is when it comes to stealing land, stealing resources, and starving out the people, and making sure that the people's self-determination is not met. Like, these are very clear by their own words. You know, a lot of time the quiet part is said out loud, but if you're not looking for it, and if you just accept the media that is given to us from CIA network or CNN or Fox News or any of these other networks, you're going to be confused, which is the whole point. To make the issues so confusing, to use language that's not really clear, and by the time you know it, you're going to be like, oh, I can't really focus on this because I have to go to work, or I have to go to my job. All of these things are intentional. So it's to your point, like, you know, we have to do the research, but we also, as we always encourage, we should join organizations, you know, and read in group settings. And it's like Comrade Salifu said on the last podcast we did, talking about the ideological shifts, one thing to do is to just ask yourself, what is, just do an evaluation of why things are the way they are in your life. Because I think a lot of us can identify with us being tired and stressed, and we all point to all of these material reasons why we are angry and stressed and tired, and it all goes back to capitalism. Capitalism is to blame. And a lot of folks, have this reductionist mindset, like, no, I mean, you can't blame everything on capitalism. You got to blame people. People have to take responsibility for their actions. But our world is influenced by the things that happen in the world. So while we have our own perspectives and worldviews, and we all have our own mindset, that is influenced by the media. It's influenced by the books we read. It's influenced by the people who are placed in front of us as a example. You look at the bourgeois class and celebrities and all of these folks that have some status in this capitalist system. They are there to somehow convince the masses that they could too be in that position, when we know that that's not the case. Most of us will never be a millionaire. Not to mention, millionaires and billionaires have that wealth because of exploitation. So there's just more depth to why this is. And I don't think it's hard, but I think it can be confusing when we are constantly 24/7. And this is why the work is so important, because it doesn't stop even if you graduate from school. I mean, you're going to be bombarded every day with capitalist ideology, and it's meant to take away your dignity and keep you in a state of constant work so that you could potentially reach this destination. But if it's not for the masses, if the masses are not free, then no one is free. So it goes back to understanding the importance of the collective. We're social beings. Just naturally, we know the importance of communicating with one another and not just having this individual mindset. And maybe we can talk about some of the reasons why this individual mindset is propagated and why folks really look at themselves as their own hero, as opposed to folks involved in organizations that realize they need others to make a change. That is not just one person building a pyramid, so to speak.
We've discussed this in a couple of our podcasts, but when we are doing research, like doing it in an organized fashion, allows us to pretty much spread the knowledge that we have much quicker. The knowledge and the wisdom that we gain from that knowledge much quicker throughout different people, and figure out a plan and work together to figure out different strategies to achieve liberation.
Right. I mean, we got to do it together. That's one thing. And going back to the topic, there's clearly limitations. Even when we hear about our history, there are limitations in terms of how much we're hearing and what the goal is of those lessons. And even when we think of African history taught in the beginning in schools, that was because the people made noise, right? They burned down the plantations. We made it clear that we were not going to stand in satisfaction with the abuse that was happening to us. And when we made noise, when we protested, that's when they're like, okay, let's put some programs in the schools. Let's do some basic education so that they feel connected. And it kind of reminds me of also representation. There's a lot of talk about representation. Folks want to see themselves in media. They want to see themselves represented. But if we understand that representation does not equal liberation, just because somebody has a face that looks like you, that doesn't mean they have the same interests as you. We know this with neocolonialism being the case, back to when Obama was president, or even now with Kamala Harris and many other African figureheads that hold positions of power, but their interests are for the corporate class and the oligarchs. Like, it doesn't matter if someone looks like you, if their interest is completely against you. And so that's another conversation that should be highlighted, because I think there's a lot of propaganda intending to have folks just be consumed with the first African man, the first African woman, the first, the first, it's the war of the first. And we think that's progress. But we know that most of the condition of Africans are not in a good state because Africa is oppressed. So having one or two or three or five is not enough to answer for the majority of us. So, thinking in collectives, understanding the importance of collective action would really help us navigate these conversations, because the more we think of the collective, we're in a better state. So how do you celebrate the stories and the music and the food, everything that African culture brings? What is one way that you think we could celebrate that in collective ways?
I mean, I think for these things, one of the main foundations is other people. So most foods, most music, really most of our culture is created not in complete isolation, but alongside other people. So we can listen and consume and eat foods that do remind us of home and that we were raised around. Uh, and we can also for one do it in groups, and two create institutions that support this, institutions that teach our histories and promote our cultures. I know for at least there's the idea of having like cultural institutes, or cultural institutes or cultural schools or language schools, in which people can, for the most part, just have a space in which the history of whether it's music or food or language can be taught on a regular basis. And with those cultural institutions, it would promote the culture and make sure that people can feel proud in who they are and where they come from, and also enjoy.
Yeah, I mean, we can have our own institutions. Back to your point, I think that's a good point to make, because we rely so much of what we are hearing, all of what we're hearing, if we're not fighting against it by being in an organization and being involved in political education process, if we don't have that process going, we're going to just be parroting everything we hear. All of the individualism that is so popular is because folks are not doing their own research, knowing why we're in this state. And if we're not joined in that collective process, we're going to mimic the same messages we hear from social media. And we already know that the state is very much involved in all of these programs, from the gaming industry, obviously movies, Hollywood, none of this stuff. We like to think that it's just what we think, that is our individual thought. Like it's my opinion, but opinions are framed by a larger context. So yeah, I fully find you aligned with that. We see just the history being repeated. This isn't new. A lot of the things that are happening now are just upgrade versions from McCarthyism and keeping people in a state of fear so that they don't have the dignity and courage to fight for what they want, because we're not going to just get it just by voting into the system. We have to take it upon ourselves to fight it and understand why this fight is important. And, when people think about all the fear mongering that's going on, all of the news that is intended to make you feel like, oh, wow, that's sad. Oh, wow. And it's like, yeah, it's sad because this whole system is messed up. This whole system is violent, and it's not meant to produce anything positive. So of course they're going to give us things that will encourage us to just bond over sadness without giving us solutions and action that is needed to take place to fight against this ongoing hellhole that we're living in. And kids are, I think right now the youth it's just very interesting to see how folks are being educated. And even with this bill being signed into law and things like that, we still see a urgent need for folks to read and know about their history, so that it's not, as the scientists claimed, oh, we don't want to hurt their feelings, and, we don't want them to be guilty about the past. And it's like, the past is related to the present. So, all of these things are connected. None of these things are disconnected like we're often framed to believe. We have to do what's necessary and know that reading is important. We got to pick up a book or listen to an audiobook. If it's hard for you to read a book, you can also listen to audiobooks and really take the time to answer why things are the way they are. Because as mentioned, nothing just comes out of nowhere. Nothing's just on our doorstep. There's a material reason for all of what we're going through. And the more we connect that material reason to where things are, we can be more clear as to how to respond in the future. So get involved, y'all. Join an organization fighting for justice. Develop some PE. It's like any muscle, you're going to get better at understanding the more you read and see what's going on. You're going to comprehend more the more you commit to reading and doing the work. So with that, we want to thank you for listening. I know this was a bit shorter of an episode, but we hope that you got something out of it. Remember that there are several other comrades doing the work. Be sure to check out Our Ancestors' Voices with Ajamu Umi and his daughter Shakura. Also the weekly Pan-African News and the Forward Ever podcast, which is on Spotify. We also encourage you to support our Forward Ever shop that's on Etsy, where you can wear with no despair a call to revolutionary action. And as we always say, forward ever, backwards never.